Have you ever held onto a single memory so tightly that it became your entire world? What if that memory was crumpled up in your pocket, faded and worn, but the only thing keeping you alive? And what if, after years of being invisible, someone from that memory saw you, not in a crowded street but on a flickering TV screen, and changed everything? Under the grey skies of a chilly November morning in Detroit, Michigan, the city hummed with the grind of early commuters and the distant wail of a factory siren. Amidst the cracked sidewalks of a forgotten neighborhood, a man shuffled along, his boots scuffing against the uneven pavement. His name was James Jimmy Carter, though few bothered to ask anymore. At 52, he was a shadow of a man, his once broad shoulders hunched under the weight of an overcoat that had seen better days, patched and thinning at the elbows. His face, weathered by time and unshaven, bore the deep lines of a life carved by struggle, and his eyes, hazel but dulled, seemed to stare through the world rather than at it. In his right pocket, his fingers instinctively brushed against something small and fragile, a photograph, its edges curled and creased, the image barely visible but etched into his soul. It was his anchor, his silent companion, the one thing the streets of Detroit couldn't strip away from him. Jimmy moved like a ghost through the Motor City, past boarded-up storefronts and murals of better times, where the spirit of Motown lingered in the air like a half-remembered song. The bitter wind whipped down from Lake St. Clair, cutting through his threadbare scarf as he trudged toward the soup kitchen on Woodward Avenue. It was a ritual as American as apple pie, except his slice of the dream had long since spoiled. He'd been on these streets for nearly a decade. Ever since he came back from Iraq with a Purple Heart, he didn't care to polish, and nightmares that wouldn't let him sleep under a roof. The VA hospital tried to help, offered pills and pamphlets, but nothing filled the hollow space where his life used to be. So he wandered from alley to shelter to the underbelly of overpasses, clutching that photo like a lifeline. Sometimes he'd pull it out under the dim glow of a street lamp, tracing the face on it with a trembling finger, whispering to himself, "Just hold on, Jimmy, she's still out there." Detroit wasn't kind to men like Jimmy, but it was the only home he knew after the war. He grew up here, in a row house not far from the old Ford plant, dreaming of muscle cars and Friday night football games under the lights at Ford Field. Now those dreams were as distant as the roar of a Lions crowd, replaced by the clatter of shopping carts pushed by other lost souls, and the distant rumble of freight trains cutting through the night. Every morning, he'd wake up on a cardboard mattress in an alley off Cass Corridor, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and check his pocket for the photo before anything else. It was ritual, like saying grace before a meal, except his meal was often scavenged from a dumpster behind a diner. He'd mutter to himself, old habits from nights in the desert, where he'd talk to keep the ghosts at bay. One more day, soldier, one more day. Jimmy's routine was a quiet war of attrition. He'd line up at the soup kitchen run by the local church, nodding silently to Pastor Mike, who always saved him a spot near the heater. The smell of burnt coffee and watery stew clung to the air as volunteers, folks with kind eyes and worn-out sneakers, dished out meals with a side of "God bless you." Jimmy took his tray to a corner, avoiding the chatter of others who'd fallen on hard times, his mind always drifting back to the photo. He'd eat slow, savoring the warmth more than the taste, then head to the library on West Grand Boulevard to escape the cold. There he'd sit near the window, watching snow dust the skeletal trees, his fingers brushing the photo in his pocket like a rosary. Some days he'd flip through old magazines, pretending to read, but really just hiding from the ache in his chest, a pain sharper than the shrapnel scar on his left shoulder. He never spoke of it, but anyone who looked close could see it. The way his hands shook when a car backfired, the way his eyes darted to every corner like he was still scanning for insurgents in Fallujah. The photo was his secret, his buried wound. He hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Pastor Mike, who'd asked once with a gentle, "You got family, Jim?" Jimmy just shook his head, his voice rough as gravel. Not anymore. But the truth was heavier than he could carry some days. The woman in the photo, her name was Clara, had been everything before the war took him away. High school sweethearts at Mumford High, they danced under the neon lights of a Motown record shop, planned a life over milkshakes at the diner on 8 Mile. She'd written him letters during his first tour, her cursive full of hope, But by the second deployment, the letters stopped. When he came back, broken and haunted, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, just an empty apartment and a silence louder than any explosion. All he had left was that photo, taken on a sunny day at Belle Isle Park, her smile brighter than the Detroit River behind her. He carried it through the war, through the streets, through the long cold nights, believing somehow it kept her close. But deep down, he knew it was a ghost he was chasing, a memory that might as well be dust. Day after day, Jimmy soldiered on, his life a loop of survival and quiet despair. He'd scrounge for bottles and cans in the alleys near Comerica Park, trading them for a few bucks at the scrapyard, enough for a hot coffee at a corner gas station. He'd watch kids bundled in winter coats, laughing as they threw snowballs, and something in him would crack, a fleeting memory of a life he could have had. Then he'd shove it down, pull his coat tighter, and keep moving. On Thanksgiving, he'd linger near houses in the suburbs of Ferndale, the smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie drifting through cracked windows, a reminder of holidays spent with Clara's family, her hand in his under the table. He'd stand there just out of sight, until the cold forced him back to the city, back to his cardboard fortress. Some nights, under the sodium glow of a streetlight, he'd dream of her voice, soft as a lullaby, but wake to the harsh bark of a stray dog or the distant wail of a cop siren. He told himself he was fine, that he didn't need more than the photo, but every step he took felt heavier, like he was marching toward a fight he couldn't win. It was on a Thursday, just as the first heavy snow of the season blanketed Detroit in a hush, that the world tilted under Jimmy's feet. He was at his usual spot near the soup kitchen, waiting for the doors to open, his breath clouding in the frosty air. The line was longer than usual, folks stampeding for a warm spot, their chatter a low hum about the news, something about a local TV station doing a holiday segment on the homeless, giving out coats and meals. Jimmy paid it no mind. He'd heard promises before and they always fell through like cheap tinsel. He adjusted his scarf, his fingers brushing the photo as always, when a van rolled up, white with a bright red logo splashed on the side. Channel 7, WXYZ, the local news affiliate. A young reporter hopped out, all smiles and polished boots, followed by a cameraman hauling gear. They started working the line, asking questions, filming faces etched with hunger and frostbite. Jimmy turned away, pulling his hood low. He didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be a story. But the reporter, a woman named Sarah with a voice too chipper for the cold, spotted him. "Sir, just a quick word. What's your story? How'd you end up here?" Jimmy froze, his heart thudding like artillery fire in his chest. He mumbled something about not wanting to talk, but Sarah pressed, her microphone hovering like a grenade. The camera's red light blinked unblinking, and for a moment he felt exposed, raw, like he was back on a battlefield with nowhere to hide. Then, before he could slip away, Sarah's eyes caught something, a flicker of movement as his hand instinctively clutched his pocket. "What's that you've got there?" she asked, her tone softening, curious. Jimmy's grip tightened, his jaw set hard, but the crowd around him had started to stare, and the weight of their eyes pinned him in place. Against every instinct screaming in his battered mind, he slowly pulled out the photo, holding it like a sacred relic, its edges trembling in his calloused fingers. Sarah leaned in, the camera zooming, and for the first time in years, Jimmy's voice cracked as he whispered, This is all I've got left of her. Clara. My Clara." The air seemed to still, even the biting wind holding its breath. Sarah's smile faltered, replaced by something real, something like awe or pity, as the camera captured the crumpled photo. A woman's face, young and radiant despite the creases, staring out from a past Jimmy couldn't reclaim. He didn't know why he'd shown it, why he'd let the world see his wound, but the words slipped out heavy and unpracticed. "I've been looking for her, or maybe just waiting, for 10 damn years." The camera lingered on his face on the photo, on the silent tears freezing on his weathered cheeks, and somewhere, miles away, in a quiet living room with a TV flickering against the darkness, a pair of eyes locked onto that broadcast, eyes that hadn't seen Jimmy Carter since the day they walked away, eyes that belonged to Clara, now wide with recognition, her hand flying to her mouth as the past came crashing back like a tidal wave. The weight of that moment on live television clung to Jimmy Carter like a second skin, heavier than the worn-out overcoat draped over his shoulders. Standing there in the biting Detroit cold, with the camera's unblinking eye fixed on him and the crumpled photo of Clara trembling in his frostbitten fingers, he felt something crack deep inside, a dam he'd built over years of silence and survival now threatening to burst. His chest tightened, each breath shallow and sharp, as if the frigid air had turned to shards of glass. He'd shown the world his heart, raw and bleeding, and now there was no taking it back. The reporter, Sarah, stood frozen for a heartbeat, her microphone dipping slightly as her practiced smile gave way to something softer, something human. The crowd around them at the soup kitchen line seemed to hold its collective breath, their curious stares boring into him, peeling back layers he'd fought so hard to keep buried. Jimmy's hazel eyes, usually dulled by the grind of the streets, flickered with a storm of emotion. Shame for exposing his pain, fear of what it meant to speak Clara's name aloud after a decade of whispers, and a gnawing ache of hope he didn't dare name. He shoved the photo back into his pocket, his hand shaking worse than it had in years, and muttered under his breath, "Shouldn't have done that, damn fool." Inside, Jimmy was a battlefield. Guilt clawed at him, whispering that he'd betrayed Clara by plastering her face on a screen for strangers to gawk at, as if she were just another sad story to fill airtime during the holiday season. What if she saw it and hated him for dragging their past into the light? What if she'd moved on, built a life without him, and this was the jagged edge that severed any lingering thread between them? But worse than the guilt was the confusion, a disorienting swirl of questions he'd buried under layers of numbness. Had he said too much? Too little? Why had his tongue betrayed him, spilling her name like a prayer he hadn't meant to speak? And beneath it all simmered a quiet, unspoken terror. What if this moment, this fleeting broadcast, was the closest he'd ever get to her again? He turned away from Sarah and the camera, pulling his hood lower over his face, his boots crunching against the fresh snow as he shuffled toward the soup kitchen door. But the weight of those eyes, the memory of his own cracked voice saying, "My Clara," followed him like a ghost he couldn't outrun. The next few hours passed in a haze, but the tension in Jimmy's world had shifted, grown taut, like a wire ready to snap. Inside the soup kitchen, the smell of watery stew and burnt coffee couldn't mask the shift in the air around him. Folks he'd shared silent meals with for years now looked at him differently, some with pity, others with a flicker of recognition, as if his story on the news had made him less invisible, more human, and somehow more broken. Pastor Mike, a burly man with a graying beard and a voice like a gravel road, sidled up to him at his usual corner table, a chipped mug of coffee in hand. "Saw you on the TV out front, Jim," he said, his tone careful, like he was stepping around landmines. "Takes guts to show something that personal. You all right?" Jimmy kept his eyes on his tray, the spoon hovering over the stew, his jaw tight. "Didn't mean for it to go down like that," he rasped, his voice low, hiding the tremor beneath. "Just got caught off guard." Pastor Mike nodded, his silence heavy with understanding, but his next words cut deeper than Jimmy expected. "Sometimes the things we hide are the things that need to be seen most. Maybe this is a door opening, not closing. Ever thought of looking for her? Really looking?" Jimmy's hand clenched around the spoon, the metal cold against his calloused palm. The idea of searching for Clara, not just dreaming of her, felt like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. "Ain't got the means, Pastor," he muttered, but the excuse tasted hollow even to him. The real obstacle wasn't money or miles, it was the fear of finding her and seeing in her eyes that he was nothing but a memory she'd rather forget. That night, under the sodium glow of a street lamp in an alley off Cass Corridor, the past came for Jimmy like an ambush. Sleep wouldn't come, not with his mind replaying the broadcast on a loop, every word he'd said about Clara echoing like gunfire in the quiet. He sat on his cardboard mattress, the photo pulled from his pocket, its creased edges softer now from years of handling, almost fragile enough to disintegrate. He traced her smile with a trembling finger, the Detroit skyline long faded in the background of the image, and whispered, "Did I do right by you today, darling? Or did I just make everything worse?" The wind howled through the alley, carrying the distant rumble of a freight train. And for a moment he swore he heard her laugh, bright and warm, like it had been on those summer nights at Belle Isle Park when they'd lain on a blanket by the river, counting stars and dreaming of forever. But the laugh faded into the cold, and all that was left was the ache, sharper now, cutting through the numbness he'd clung to for so long. He remembered the last time he'd seen her, before his second tour, her eyes red from crying as she begged him not to go back. "You've done enough, Jimmy, stay, we'll figure it out," she'd pleaded, her voice breaking. But he'd gone anyway, duty and pride drowning out her words, and when he returned, shattered and hollow, she was gone. No note, no explanation, just an empty space where her laughter used to live. The memory burned, a fresh wound reopened by the day's exposure, and he shoved the photo back into his pocket, curling into himself against the cold, wondering if he'd just lost her all over again by letting the world see her face. The next morning the tension ratcheted tighter, the world around Jimmy conspiring to push him toward a ledge he wasn't ready to face. Word of the broadcast had spread like wildfire through Detroit's underbelly, carried on whispers in soup kitchen lines and shelters. Strangers approached him, their curiosity a mix of kindness and intrusion, asking about the woman in the picture, as if she were a character in a story they had a right to know. At the library on West Grand Boulevard, where he usually found solace in the quiet hum of flickering fluorescence and the smell of old paper, he couldn't escape the weight of it all. A young volunteer, a girl with braids and a gentle smile, slid a newspaper across the table to him. The local section opened to a small blurb about the Channel 7 segment. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said softly, her eyes searching his. Jimmy stared at the grainy black-and-white image of himself holding the photo, the headline reading, "Veterans' Heartfelt Search for Lost Love Captures Holiday Spirit." His stomach churned, a mix of humiliation and raw exposure, and he pushed the paper away, his voice gruff. "Ain't looking for no pity parade." But the girl didn't back off, her tone steady. "It's not pity, sir. It's people care. Maybe someone out there knows her. Maybe this helps." Her words hung in the air, an obstacle and a lifeline all at once, forcing Jimmy to confront a truth he'd dodged for years. Hiding wasn't just protecting him. It was keeping him from answers, from closure, maybe even from Clara herself. As days bled into each other, each colder than the last, discoveries began to surface, each one a shard of the past slicing into Jimmy's carefully constructed armor. It started with a worn-out envelope slipped into his hand by Pastor Mike at the soup kitchen, the paper yellowed and smelling faintly of dust. "Found this in the lost and found box from years back," Mike said, his brow furrowed. "It's got your name on it. Been sitting there since before I started running this place." Jimmy's heart thudded as he saw the familiar cursive on the front. Clara's handwriting, unmistakable even after a decade. His hands shook as he tore it open. The letter inside dated just months after he'd returned from Iraq, when he was already spiraling into the streets. "Jimmy," it read, "I waited as long as I could, but I couldn't watch you drown and not be able to save you. I'm sorry I had to go for both of us. If you ever find yourself again, I'll be in Chicago. I still wear the locket you gave me. Clara." The words hit like a grenade, exploding every assumption he'd nursed in the dark. She hadn't abandoned him without a word. She'd tried, and he'd been too lost to see it. Chicago, a place, a direction, a thread to pull. But with it came a fresh wave of pain. 10 years of thinking she'd forgotten him, when she'd been waiting, hoping, wearing a piece of him close to her heart. He folded the letter with unsteady hands, tucking it beside the photo in his pocket, the weight of both now a tangible ache against his rib cage. Pastor Mike watched him, his voice low. "What you gonna do with that, Jim?" Jimmy's reply was barely a whisper, loaded with a fear he couldn't shake. "Don't know if I got the right to chase her down after all this time. Don't know if I'm still the man she'd want to find." The conflict deepened with every passing moment, each interaction a mirror reflecting Jimmy's broken pieces back at him. Sarah, the reporter, tracked him down again, this time near the iconic Detroit Institute of Arts, its grand facade looming over Woodward Avenue like a monument to a city that refused to die. The museum steps were dusted with snow, the air carrying the faint echo of traffic from downtown, and Jimmy had come here to escape, to sit and stare at the thinker statue, lost in thoughts of what might have been. But Sarah's polished boots crunched against the snow as she approached, her cameraman in tow, her voice softer now, less rehearsed. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to check in. That segment, it's gotten a lot of attention. People are calling in, asking about you, about Clara. We could do a follow-up, help get the word out." Jimmy's shoulders tensed, his gaze fixed on the ground, the cold seeping through his thin gloves as his fingers brushed the pocket holding the letter and photo. "I ain't sure I want more eyes on this," he said, his tone rough, but beneath it was a plea she couldn't hear. "Don't make me hope when I'm not ready to break again." Sarah hesitated, then sat beside him on the steps, the camera off for once. "I get it. But sometimes letting people help is the hardest part. You don't have to do this alone." Her words echoed Pastor Mike's, a chorus of voices pushing against the walls Jimmy had built. And for the first time he felt the cracks widening, the possibility of letting someone in both terrifying and strangely warm. The days that followed were a slow unraveling, each revelation and encounter peeling back another layer of Jimmy's guarded heart. At a shelter near the old Michigan Central Station, a fellow veteran named Earl, a grizzled man with a limp and a habit of humming Motown tunes, overheard Jimmy muttering Clara's name in his sleep. The next morning, over tin mugs of watery oatmeal, Earl leaned in, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you talking last night, Carter. Lost someone too back in Nam. Never stopped looking till I found her grave. Don't let the years steal your chance, man. You got a name, a city, more than most of us got. Go." The advice, raw and unfiltered, landed like a punch, stirring a restlessness in Jimmy he couldn't ignore. Earl's eyes, clouded with his own ghosts, held no judgment, only a shared understanding of loss that cut across decades and wars. Jimmy nodded slowly, gripping the edge of the wooden table, the letter and photo burning a hole in his pocket. But the doubt lingered, a shadow whispering that he was too broken, too late, too far gone to be the man Clara once loved. Each night, under the skeletal shadows of overpasses, he'd pull out the letter, reading her words by the dim light of a flickering street lamp, tracing the word Chicago like it was a map to absolution or ruin. The emotional storm inside Jimmy built to a breaking point, the weight of every word, every memory, every fleeting chance pressing down until he felt he might shatter. It came to a head on a grey afternoon, the sky over Detroit heavy with the promise of more snow. As he sat in the library again, the letter open on the table before him. His eyes kept drifting to the words, "I'll be in Chicago," each syllable a siren's call he couldn't silence. Around him the hum of the library was a distant murmur, the smell of old books and floor polish grounding him even as his mind spun. He thought of the broadcast, of Clara's face on that screen, of the letter proving she hadn't erased him completely. He thought of Pastor Mike's quiet faith, Sarah's unexpected kindness, Earl's haunted encouragement, and he thought of himself, hunched, weary, clinging to a photo like it was his last breath. For the first time in years, a question burned brighter than his fear. What if she was still waiting, still wearing that locket, still holding a piece of him as tightly as he held her? But with it came the terror of finding her only to lose her again, of seeing in her eyes that the man she loved had died somewhere in Iraq, leaving behind a shell she couldn't recognize. The decision, when it came, was a jagged, painful thing, born of a desperation Jimmy hadn't felt since his darkest nights on the streets. He folded the letter, tucked it beside the photo, and stood, his boots heavy against the library's worn floor. His heart hammered, each beat a war drum as he walked out into the cold, the wind cutting through him like a memory of every loss he'd endured. He didn't know if he had the strength for this, didn't know if he deserved the chance, but the weight of staying still, of letting another decade slip by without trying, was heavier than any fear. He headed toward the soup kitchen, knowing Pastor Mike would be there, knowing he'd need help to make this journey, help he'd never asked for before. As he walked, the Detroit skyline stretched before him, the Renaissance Center's glass towers glinting in the distance like a beacon of something he couldn't yet name. He muttered to himself, a soldier's mantra against the storm inside. One step, Jimmy. Just one step. And somewhere in that decision, buried beneath layers of doubt and pain, flickered a spark of the man he used to be, the man who'd once promised Clara forever under a starlit sky. By the way, If this story's hitting you as hard as it's hitting us, make sure to subscribe for the next part. We're not done yet, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. Back to Jimmy. His choice to move forward, to chase a ghost that might not want to be found, set the stage for a reckoning he'd spent a decade running from. He didn't know if Chicago held salvation or heartbreak, didn't know if Clara's locket still carried his name, but for the first time in years, he was marching towards something, not away. And as the snow began to fall again, dusting the cracked sidewalks of Detroit, each flake felt like a countdown to a moment that would either rebuild him or break him for good. As the snow fell heavier over Detroit, Jimmy Carter took his first steps toward a future he couldn't yet grasp, each crunch of his boots on the icy pavement echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet morning. He'd made his choice to chase Clara, to follow the fragile thread of her letter pointing to Chicago, but the weight of it sat heavy in his chest, a mix of raw hope and bone-deep dread. Pastor Mike had been waiting at the soup kitchen, his weathered face lighting up with a quiet nod, when Jimmy mumbled his plan, asking for help to get to the Windy City. "Got some folks who owe me favors, Jim," Mike had said, his voice steady like a lifeline. "We'll get you a bus ticket and a little cash for the road. You just keep that fire lit in you." Within hours, Jimmy held a crumpled Greyhound ticket in his hand, the ink smudged from his nervous grip, the departure set for the next dawn. But as he sat in the shelter that night, the ticket tucked beside Clara's photo and letter in his pocket, the storm inside him roared louder than ever. What if Chicago was just a grave for old dreams? What if Clara saw him now, a broken man, carved hollow by war and the streets, and turned away for good? His hands shook as he traced the edges of the photo under the dim shelter light, his whisper barely audible over the snores of other lost souls. "I'm coming, darling. God help me if I'm too late." The bus ride out of Detroit felt like crossing a battlefield, every mile stretching the tension in Jimmy's nerves to a breaking point. The Greyhound rattled along I-94, its seats smelling of stale coffee and worn-out dreams, the windows streaked with grime as the Michigan landscape gave way to the flat expanse of Indiana. Jimmy sat near the back, his overcoat pulled tight against the heater's weak warmth, his eyes fixed on the passing world outside, snow-dusted fields, rusted billboards, and the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse. Every jolt of the bus seemed to mirror the lurch in his chest, the fear of what awaited him in Chicago growing sharper with each hour. He hadn't been this far from Detroit since the war, hadn't felt this exposed since he'd shipped out to Iraq with Clara's letters tucked in his pack. Now clutching her photo instead, he felt like a soldier again, marching toward an ambush he couldn't predict. What if she wasn't there? What if the Clara from the letter, still wearing the locket he'd given her on their first anniversary, had vanished into a new life, a new name, a new love? His fingers tightened around the ticket stub, the paper crumpling under the strain, and he muttered to himself, a mantra against the panic rising like bile. 1 mile at a time, soldier. Just 1 mile. But beneath the words lingered a terror he couldn't shake. The closer he got to Chicago, the closer he got to a truth that might shatter him beyond repair. When the bus finally pulled into the Greyhound station on West Harrison Street, Chicago loomed before Jimmy like a fortress of glass and steel, its skyline piercing the gray winter sky with an indifference that made his stomach churn. The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped off, the wind howling off Lake Michigan, cutting through his threadbare scarf and biting at the scars on his weathered face. He had nothing but a name, a city, and a decade-old letter, no address, no plan beyond the ache in his chest screaming to find her. Pastor Mike had given him the number of a shelter near the South Loop, a place to start, along with a few bucks for coffee and a battered old phone book scavenged from the church basement. Standing there in the station, surrounded by the bustle of travelers rushing past, briefcases swinging, voices sharp with purpose, Jimmy felt smaller than he ever had on Detroit's streets, a ghost in a city that didn't know his name. His hand brushed the pocket holding Clara's photo, and for a moment he considered turning back, catching the next bus to Detroit, where at least the pain was familiar. But the memory of her cursive, "I'll be in Chicago. I still wear the locket," burned through the doubt, pushing him forward into the unknown. He shuffled toward the shelter, his boots dragging against the slush, each step heavier with the weight of a question he couldn't answer. Was he walking toward redemption or a final goodbye? Days turned into a grueling blur as Jimmy scoured Chicago with a desperation that bordered on madness, the tension coiling tighter with every dead end. The shelter, a drafty brick building smelling of mildew and despair, became his base, a place to crash on a cot surrounded by others who'd lost their way. Each morning, he'd wake before dawn, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and set out with the phone book under his arm, flipping through pages smudged with coffee stains and pencil marks, searching for any trace of Clara, her maiden name, her married name if she'd taken one, any variation he could think of. He haunted public libraries on State Street, their warmth a temporary refuge as he pored over outdated records, his fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from the fear of finding nothing. He called numbers that led to disconnected tones or strangers with no patience for a gravelly voice asking about a woman from a past they didn't share. He showed the photo to shopkeepers in neighborhoods he guessed she might have settled, near the old jazz clubs of Bronzeville, the quiet streets of Hyde Park, each shake of a head or pitying look slicing deeper into the hope he'd dared to carry. "Ain't seen her, man," they'd say, or worse, "Good luck, buddy," their tone dripping with the kind of sympathy that felt like a funeral. At night, back at the shelter, he'd sit on his cot, the photo trembling in his hands, whispering apologies to her fading smile. "I'm trying, Clara. I swear I am." But with each passing day, the city seemed to grow larger, colder, its endless grid of streets a maze designed to keep him lost, the silence of her absence louder than the roar of the L trains overhead. The breaking point came on a bitter evening near the end of December, the tension inside Jimmy so taut it felt like his ribs might crack under the strain. He'd spent the day trudging through Pilsen, a neighborhood alive with murals and the chatter of Spanish floating from taquerias, following a tip from a shelter volunteer about a Clara who worked at a community center there. His boots were soaked from slush, his hands numb as he clutched the photo, its edges now so worn they threatened to tear with every touch. The center was a squat building with peeling paint, the air inside smelling of chalk and cheap heater fumes, and when he asked for her at the front desk, the young woman behind it studied him with wary eyes before shaking her head. "No Clara here, sir. Sorry." The words landed like a final shot, the last of his fragile resolve crumbling as he turned away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of 10 years' worth of longing. He stumbled outside, the wind biting at the tears freezing on his cheeks, and found himself on a bench near 18th Street, the glow of Christmas lights from a nearby storefront mocking the darkness inside him. He pulled out the photo, staring at Clara's face as if she could answer the ache tearing through him. "I can't do this no more," he rasped, his voice raw, breaking in the empty night. "I thought I could find you, but I'm just chasing ghosts. I'm sorry, darling. I'm so damn sorry." The city pulsed around him, oblivious to the man breaking apart on a cold bench. Every hope he'd carried from Detroit now a shard of glass in his chest, cutting deeper with every breath. Just as the weight of failure threatened to bury him for good, the moment of truth arrived with a quietness that stole the air from his lungs. He hadn't noticed the woman approaching, her steps hesitant on the slick sidewalk, her breath clouding in the frigid night as she stopped a few feet from the bench. She was bundled in a navy coat, a scarf wrapped tight around her neck, her hair streaked with grey at the edges, but her eyes, those eyes Jimmy had traced in memory 1,000 times, locked onto him with a recognition that stopped his heart. Clara. Her hand flew to her chest, fingers brushing a small silver locket peeking from beneath her scarf, and her voice, soft but trembling with a decade's worth of unspoken pain, cut through the silence. "Jimmy? Oh my God, is that really you?" He froze, the photo slipping from his grip to the snow-dusted ground, his hazel eyes wide and unblinking as if she were a mirage that might vanish if he moved. But she stepped closer, her own tears catching the glow of the streetlights, and knelt to pick up the photo, her fingers brushing his as she did. "You kept this all this time?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the words, and in that moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, the years of separation collapsing under the weight of a shared past, too heavy to ignore. Their words spilled out in a rush, a torrent of pain and longing that had been dammed up for far too long. Clara sat beside him on the bench, her hands clutching the photo as if it were a bridge between who they'd been and who they were now. "I saw you on the news," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Back in Detroit, holding this picture, saying my name. I didn't know if it was real, if you'd even want to see me after everything. But I had to come back, had to try. I've been checking shelters, community spots, anywhere I thought you might be." Jimmy's throat tightened, his own voice rough as gravel when he spoke. "I got your letter. Just now, after all these years. Thought you'd forgotten me, moved on. I didn't think I had the right to come looking." Her eyes softened, glistening with unshed tears, and she touched the locket again, popping it open to reveal a tiny photo of them at Belle Isle, younger and unscarred by the world. "I never forgot, Jimmy. I left because I couldn't watch you drown after the war, couldn't fight the ghosts you brought back. I thought leaving would save us both, but I've carried you with me every day." The confession hung between them, raw and aching, a wound they'd both carried in silence, and Jimmy's hand reached for hers, hesitant at first, then firm, as if letting go might break him again. "I ain't the man I was, Clara," he murmured, his voice cracking. "War took that from me. The streets took the rest, but I never stopped loving you. Not for a damn second." She squeezed his hand, her tears falling freely now, and in her quiet sob he heard something he hadn't felt in years. Forgiveness, not just from her, but a sliver of it for himself. The transformation in Jimmy was slow to surface, but when it did, it was as undeniable as the Chicago wind cutting through the night. In the days that followed, Clara didn't promise miracles. She couldn't erase the decade of pain or the scars of war etched into his soul, but she offered a start, a fragile bridge to rebuild on. She'd built a quiet life in Chicago, working at a non-profit helping veterans, a job born from the loss she'd felt when Jimmy returned broken from Iraq. Now she brought him into that world, not as a project or a pity case, but as someone worth fighting for. She helped him find a spot at a transitional housing program, a small room of his own with a bed that didn't smell of alleyways, and connected him with a counselor who understood the nightmares that still woke him in a cold sweat. Jimmy, for the first time in years, didn't flinch at the offer of help, didn't push away the hands reaching out. He started showing up to group meetings at Clara's nonprofit, his voice shaky, but growing steadier as he shared fragments of his story with others who'd walked through their own hells. His routine shifted, no longer a loop of survival but a tentative rhythm of healing. Coffee with Clara on quiet mornings at a diner near Lakeshore Drive, their conversations a slow dance of rediscovery. Odd jobs at the non-profit, sweeping floors or sorting donations, his hands finding purpose beyond clutching a photo. The change wasn't loud or sudden, but it was there in the way his shoulders straightened just a fraction, in the way his hazel eyes began to hold a flicker of light instead of just shadow. But transformation demanded a sacrifice, a letting go of the armor Jimmy had worn for a decade. And it came on a snowy afternoon a week before Christmas, the city draped in a hush as flakes fell thick and soft. He and Clara stood on the shore of Lake Michigan at Navy Pier, the water a slate-gray mirror stretching into the horizon, the cold biting at their faces as they held hands like they used to under Detroit's starlit skies. In his other hand, Jimmy clutched the photo, its edges so worn they'd begun to tear, the image of Clara's younger smile almost lost to time. He looked at it one last time, his thumb tracing the familiar lines, then at Clara beside him, her real smile etched with the years they'd lost, but also the hope they were clawing back. "I don't need this no more," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Got the real thing right here." With a trembling breath he let the photo go, watching as the wind caught it, carrying it out over the lake until it disappeared into the grey, a silent renunciation of the ghost he'd chased for so long. Clara's hand tightened in his, her own breath catching, and in that act Jimmy shed not just the photo but the weight of a past he'd clung to as his only anchor, stepping into a present that terrified him, but felt worth the risk. The resolution came in the quiet of that same evening, as Jimmy and Clara walked away from the pier, the city's lights twinkling around them like a promise neither had dared to make until now. They stopped near a small park off Michigan Avenue, where a lone bench sat beneath a street lamp, its glow casting a warm circle in the falling snow. On the bench, unnoticed by most passers-by, sat a tiny pair of mittens, child-sized and bright red, left behind as if waiting for their owner to return. Jimmy paused, his eyes catching on them, and a memory flickered. Him and Clara, years ago, dreaming of a family, of little hands to hold on winter days like this. He didn't say it aloud, but the look he shared with Clara held the weight of that unspoken dream. A shared ache now softened by the chance to rebuild something new, even if it wasn't what they'd once pictured. They sat on the bench, the mittens between them, like a quiet testament to what could still be. Her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her for the first time in a decade, the warmth of her presence a shield against the cold that had defined so much of his life. In that still moment, under the snow and the lamp's soft light, time itself seemed to pause, offering them a sliver of peace carved from years of pain, a reminder that even broken things can be mended if you hold on long enough. And as they sat there, wrapped in the silence of a city that had finally given them back to each other, a universal truth settled over them like the snow dusting their coats. Healing doesn't erase the scars of war or the weight of loss, but it builds bridges over the ruins, quiet paths where love can walk again if you're brave enough to take the first step. Life, with all its sharp edges, grants second chances in whispers, not shouts. And sometimes the bravest fight isn't on a battlefield, but in the choice to keep searching, to keep hoping, even when the odds are a bitter wind against your back. Jimmy and Clara, two souls weathered by time, sat in that fragile warmth, not knowing what tomorrow would demand, but knowing they'd face it side by side. And that was enough. For now, it was everything. If this story of loss and reunion, of scars and second chances, has touched something in you, let us know in the comments. Write, "I believe in healing," if you felt it too. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start again, and hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories that crack the heart open in the best way. We're here to keep telling them, and we'd love to have you along for the ride.